Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the upcoming eclipses. Tomorrow we have a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, and then in a couple weeks we have a solar eclipse in Gemini. Um, Now, there's a couple points that I have kind of sketched out here. Um, One of which is that there's in a certain astrological tradition, there's actually exaltations associated with the eclipses. Another point that I have here is having to do with Jupiter, the ruler of Sagittarius, being well dignified in Pisces. Another point is the proximity of the lunar nodes to the fixed stars of Aldebaran and Antares, and the Mars Pluto opposition that's upcoming. So I'm going to try to get through all these different points in the process of my video. I also have some kind of philosophical ideas about the kind of nature of storytelling, um, which maybe plays off of if you saw my last video I made on the lunar nodes in Gemini and Sagittarius, I may kind of be getting into some of those themes again. So to start off, I'm usually not the kind of person who makes astrology videos and of like making it all super positive, right? Like I've some people might be like, "Oh, it's like a portal for manifesting and your dreams are going to come true and everything's going to be great," and making it sound super like hyper positive to try to lure people in to get attention and stuff. I'm kind of more of the way to just like put that kind of stuff aside and just take a look at what's going on in a more neutral way without a temptation to spin it in positive or negative, but more of like, let's just see what's going on. And to be fair, though, eclipses are usually not the most positive association. Historically, they're more to seen as kind of like ominous times of coming, drama or big shakeups or changes. However, um, there's this is a bit, I might be doing things a bit differently now because there's certain things going on with this eclipse which may not necessarily make it just entirely positive, but at least you could see it as a kind of a silver lining or conditions which are improving what is going on with the eclipse. And this, of course, okay, the first idea is a kind of I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on this. I basically just got it out of a video where somebody who's a much more, you know, studied scholarly astrologer was giving a talk on the lunar nodes basically, and I thought it was just an interesting tidbit that apparently there was one certain tradition. I think it was Arabic astrologers in the medieval times who actually designated exaltations or dignities for the lunar nodes, and that they said that the north node was exalted in Gemini and that the south node was exalted in Sagittarius. And if I remember correctly, there was a kind of variation of that where if you're using a sidereal system, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that you've got the fixed star in Antares in Sagittarius, which is the heart of the scorpion. So you've got, like the heart of the scorpion star in the Sagittarius constellation. Um, Apparently a lot of people are familiar with the fact that the actual fixed stars do not match the tropical zodiac, that they're different systems. So you could this kind of complicates it because you could interpret that in terms of Scorpio and Taurus rather than Sagittarius and Gemini. For the sake of this video, because I do most of my work with tropical astrology, I'm just going to stick with Gemini and Sagittarius. And I think that just playing around with it, I can sort of see it kind of makes sense to me why the North Node would exalt in Gemini and why the South Node would exalt in Sagittarius. Um, if you think about why, if you think about Gemini, Gemini is the increase of light towards the summer solstice. So things are increasing and growing. And in traditional astrology, the North Node represented a kind of an increase. If you think about Sagittarius, this is the point where the light is growing darkest right before winter solstice. So it would make sense that Sagittarius, the South Node in Sagittarius, which would be an exaltation of the decrease or the detachment of the South Node. If you think about the principle of Gemini being about variety and diversity, what is variety and diversity but more that you, instead of just having, Gemini is represented by the twins, so you've got the two, right, which is a kind of a duality. But what happens when you start adding I'm thinking about Deleuze and Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus. There's this chapter where they criticize the idea of talking about dream images in singular, like that they're criticizing Freud for talking about the appearance of the wolf in a dream, but they only deal with either a wolf or a this, a that. What about the pack of wolves? What about the multiplicity, right? And there's something about Gemini which stands for this multiplicity, where you get beyond the binary of 1 and 2 or the trinity of 3, and you get a big pack of something. And so there's something about the increase of the North Node, which keeps adding on, which keeps giving more. And the idea of the multiple perspectives, multiple points of view, multiple narratives, multiple ways of looking at things, multiple cultural traditions, and this whole idea of relativity, all right, where it's just like, that's just your opinion, man. Like the Big Lebowski what's the real truth, or is it just opinion, or is it just different cultural perspectives or different relative positions. This is all kind of like the Gemini thing. And when you take the South Node in Sagittarius, there's something about, even if we just go with the basic cliche of Sagittarius, if they say that Sagittarius loves to travel, right? And so it's kind of like something goes wrong, rather than sticking around and brooding about it, Sagittarius will get a plane ticket and, fly off somewhere. Or the idea of like, you see on all these like pop astrology boards of like Sagittarius having this quality that's like, don't start shit with me because I'll just like, forget you and move on faster than anybody else. And to me, this really speaks to the detachment of what the South Node represents. The South Node kind of represents this quality of, just forget about it and move on. Or if something, don't cry over spilt milk kind of thing, or of this. It's also this thing about non-attachment, which is an important kind of spiritual value. And Sagittarius has often been kind of talked about as like the philosopher. There's an association, maybe even with like religion, being a member of the clergy. Like it's kind of like a priestly kind of uh, zodiac sign. And there's this basic principle. One of the core things about Buddhism is that everything is always changing, everything's always in flux, and that if you are non-attached, if you're not attached to things being a specific way, not in staying that way, because they're not going to stay that way, it's always going to change, then you are more, that kind of non-attachment makes you more able to kind of like go with the flow, roll with the punches, and adapt, I guess, to the changing circumstances. Um, there's also, I was also thinking that in my own life, an important principle has been that of neti neti, which is not this, not that. And if you think about the North Node in Gemini representing an increase of multiple perspectives, being adding on, what about this point of idea? What about that idea? What about this option? What about that option? Then Sagittarius is actually quite opposite. It's more about the reduction of things, which is dissolve and coagulate, right? Of in alchemy, or like you're rather than adding all these things in, you're reducing. You're trying to like purify something so it's just the most fundamental principle, and you're separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. Neti is from yoga, Hinduism. It's this idea of not this, not that, so that there's all the, whereas the mind will present all these different stories about what the ultimate truth might be, but they're all kind of only true in a relative sense, right? They're only true, um, I talked about in my last video on the nodes, this thing about like people. One person has the tail of the elephant, the other person has the trunk, the other person has the leg, and it's all you're grasping at different parts of the elephant. Nobody can tell it's an elephant because one person thinks it's like a tree, one person thinks it's a snake, and so, which is all relatively true and a partial truth, but the neti is rejecting each of those partial truths and not mistaking them for the entire truth, which maybe it cannot be communicated in that Mercury way, with language, with symbols, with thoughts, with ideas. And so there's this kind of like reductionism, which I think goes really well with the self node. I wrote out a quote here from Meister Eckhart, who was a Christian mystic. Um, and he said, God is not found in the soul by adding anything, but by a process of subtraction. And so, if you think about a lot of spiritual traditions, they'll say, um, you don't have to seek outside of yourself, or that spirituality isn't going to give you anything that you don't have already. What you have to do is remove the obstacle, removing your ignorance, removing whatever is obstructing the light. And it's like the sun. If there's a cloudy sky, the sun is still there. It's just that there's something in the way obstructing that light from getting through. You don't have to go find the light that got when it's missing. You actually just have to wait for the clouds to pass, or you have to let something be removed that's obstructing your vision. And so, in this sort of idea of the self node being in Sagittarius and the self node being a kind of a decrease, I think that it's actually, this is like the silver lining, anyways, if you want to spin it positively, is that if we're not attached to certain things in life, whether that's a circumstance, whether that's a certain story or a certain perspective, on things, if we're able to be non-attached and let those things pass by like clouds in the sky, and not be clinging on, hoping that cloud just stays there. If we can let that kind of just move on by, the truth will reveal itself in a way that doesn't require so much effort. Um, and so that this is kind of thing where I think a self node lunar in eclipse can actually be seen as a really dignified thing in a way. Um, and to add to this, Jupiter, which stands for the teacher, which is in a way Jupiter. Even the big teachings are themselves kinds of stories, right? Because anything that can be communicated is a story. But between Mercury and Jupiter, we have the big story and the little story. Like Mercury might be more of like the gossip or the small details about this or that happened, whereas Jupiter may be the big picture. What's the big story of why we're here and what we're doing, or the spiritual truths and stuff like that. Now, which is kind of interesting because we've got this thing that happens where there are many different traditions, many different perspectives, and people will go to war over what they see as true. And even even if you're not looking at this from a spiritual point of view, I've been having my own kind of conflicts with this around stuff like conspiracy theories and the COVID issue and stuff like that, where it's basically a conflict of different stories. One person might believe this is true, the other person might believe that is true, and there's some kind of a conflict or a tension there. Now, um, I think if anything, what's helpful in this kind of circumstance is Jupiter, which stands for the bigger kind of story, the more unifying, boundary dissolving, transcending of the differences in Pisces, which is the kind of the dreamy, transcendent kind of sign. Um, there's an opportunity for not getting hung up on the story, not getting hung up on the attachment to a certain idea of how things are, how things should be, or um, and to illustrate that, the the decan image, each decan of a sign is associated with a card from the minor arcana. Jupiter is currently in the part of Pisces that is associated with this card here. I don't know, my lighting maybe is not so good, but this is the card. Um, so the guy is walking away from the cups. So I think you can kind of look at that in a way where, there's this idea of spiritual surrender, right? Where if you're really defensive, if you're really kind of like guarding your point of view, guarding, defending your story, defending this position, you're gonna stay there, protecting these cups. You're gonna have be all armored up, and you're gonna be all vigilant, like keeping an eye out for who's gonna take your. So there's a certain kind of like non-attachment in this image where the guy is walking away from the cups, where um, you just have this is it's kind of like you just have to let it go. You have to let it go, walk away, and maybe there's something bigger. Like there's a kind of like spiritual. The pilgrimage in this. Like there's something more than what you've accumulated already, and you can't be attached to what you've already accumulated. You may have to kind of step away, and you may have to move on. Um, if you think about these these eclipses, Sagittarius and Gemini, as well as Pisces, are all mutable signs. So that the mutable signs, mutable means changeable, right? Mutable means you're not just fixed in one position, that there's a transition from one thing to the other thing. There's a sense of kind of moving on and changing. And when it's a help to have Jupiter in Pisces, which is a it's the water sign associated with this mutable changing quality. So if you think about, you know, Cancer is cardinal water, so it's a kind of a the beginning, right? Initiating something at a kind of emotional level. And Scorpio, the next one, is a fix, so it's trying to sustain something. Scorpio being much more defensive than Pisces, right? Scorpio wants to protect what's been established. With Pisces, there's a kind of a sense that things are going to change, and that there's a sense that you have to let go, and there may be a kind of an emotional catharsis or release, or it's understanding it's kind of futile at this point to just hold on and grip onto this situation, and it's more about the idea of surrendering, releasing, letting go. And on top of this, it's not one of the things, as I learned more about astrology, um, when you've got the nodal axis running through signs like Sagittarius and Gemini, if you've got a planet that's squaring the nodal axis, that's at this point which is called on the bending. Now, if to actually explain what the nodal axis is the nodal axis is this point where the moon crosses the path of the sun. This is why when the sun and the moon are both around the nodal axis, this is why when we have eclipses happening, because they're both kind of bumping into each other in the sky and one eclipses the other. The difference between the north node and the south node from an astronomical point of view is that the north node is when the moon is crossing the path of the sun, but it's going in upwards. It's heading up in the sky, and when it crosses the path on the south node, it's heading down in the sky. And so that is where we get the symbolism, the symbolic language of an increase and a decrease. So, what happens? So, what's this thing when I'm talking about squaring the nodes on the bending? Well, the bending is not the point where it's crossing the path, but the furthest that it goes, either downwards or upwards. Now, okay, so Jupiter isn't precisely squaring the nodes. It's not at 10 degree. It would be at 10 degrees Pisces if it was like exactly squaring the nodes. But this is okay. So Jupiter is in the part of the zodiac where the moon is at reaches its lowest point right now. And because of that, this Pisces this year, in relation to the nodal axis, Pisces has the quality of more of this reduction, more of this releasing, more of this letting go. And it's not Pisces, Jupiter. This is one thing about Jupiter and Pisces that I don't necessarily think that Jupiter and Pisces, even though Jupiter's about abundance and growth and getting all the, the good luck and getting all the nice stuff, there's something about Jupiter and Pisces that I've noticed that since it's gone in there, it's it's strong in Pisces because it's its own domicile, but Pisces is a very emotional, watery sign that has to do with this emotional catharsis. It's like when we say that Pisces is associated with dreams, what's happening when you're dreaming is that in a way you're kind of like digesting all this stuff from your life, and you're kind of, it's like all this stuff that's happened, you are kind of, I don't want to use the word processing, but that's kind of what it is. It's like you are going through all this material so that you can kind of surrender it, let it go, release it, and open up for the next thing. And that, with the south bending being in Pisces, I think that just kind of really emphasizes this quality of what you would call surrender, letting go, being non-attached, and also maybe even like grieving, feeling emotions. Um, but I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of going on a bit too much about this particular point. But that is what I kind of associate with the lunar eclipse. So the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius is the self node. Pisces has the self bending. Jupiter is there, and I think I mentioned this thing in another post I did of like it's like psychic lubricant. Like you've got this sort of like slippery. It's like when you'd be, like maybe sometimes where like you want, if you're really holding on to something, you want to have like sandpaper. You want to have like these gloves that have like you can really grip onto something. Whereas Jupiter and Pisces, it's more of like the slippery fish, right? It's like even if you want to hang on to it, the quality of Jupiter and Pisces is it's just going to slip out of your hands anyway. So it's like there's something about Jupiter and Pisces which helps. It's not going to help if you want to hang on to things the way they are, though. I don't think so. It's not going to help. It's not might not even help in terms of getting what you want. But in terms of letting go and this kind of release and this kind of surrender, I think that is the dignified, that's the silver lining of this current transit. Ah. Okay, so I'll move on to my next point, which is Aldebaran and Antares, which is kind of in the other direction because these two fixed stars both are said to have a kind of militant Mars like quality to them. So, just to sort of give a bit of perspective here, Aldebaran is in the constellation of Taurus, and Antares is the heart of the Scorpion. So, at one point in time, these would be more associated with Taurus and Scorpio, but because we have the precession of the equinoxes that so many smart asses, I should say, like to point out, yes, it's true, the constellations do not match up with the tropical zodiac. It's all moved over one, and you have different systems. If you practice Jyotish or Vedic astrology, you're going to be using a sidereal zodiac, where Aldebaran and Antares are still associated with Taurus and Scorpio. Um, these are also the royal fixed stars, and they're 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 basically they're powerful points in the zodiac. And there's something specifically about Aldebaran and Antares where it's implied there's a kind of a rivalry between them. And um, Aldebaran, it has this kind of thing, like I said, it was militant, but there's something about it which is maybe even strategic. It's um, I'm just gonna put it out there anyways. I'm gonna say that I don't consider myself to be an expert on the fixed stars by any means. I'm still learning. I think I think it's kind of interesting to be at the point though. Maybe like once you consider yourself an expert, your ideas have become kind of fossilized and fixed and kind of this concrete thing that you can't question. But exploring it as a beginner, where I'm trying to figure out what this really means, um, there's more of a room for this kind of curiosity and exploration. And I'm going to offer an interpretation of how I kind of perceive some of the dynamic with Aldebaran and Tares is that, well, if you think about Gemini, all right, I'm never mind this. It's if you symbolically come, it might even be a technique where you could like look at take the idea of the fixed star, but what does it mean now that we're using a tropical zodiac and it's in Gemini season and all this kind of stuff that the eclipse is happening, right? Because the tropical zodiac means we're associated more with summer solstice, the actual seasonal points, and then associating the meaning of the signs that Cancer starts at the peak of daylight. It doesn't start when the moon hits this star in the sky, right? Or the sun hits this star in the sky. It's more about the seasonal timing of things. Um, with in Gemini season, there's something about Gemini that's often kind of like I use the term the kid in the candy store, or there's something about the novelty of like fun and games and like video games or board games or even maybe like sports or something. And there's this kind of like the variety and the like you're at the arcade and all the lights are flashing and the sounds are going off, and that you win the teddy bear, the cloth, the claw thing that goes and picks up all the different toys and stuff like that you get the variety of all the different toys and all the it's kind of like this superficial kind of excitement because you might win some prize and feel all excited, and then you just forget about it or something. I think there's that kind of thing with Gemini. And one of the things though that I've been thinking about, I mean, I made this post recently that I don't, I don't, I don't. There's something about me that I'm a bit turned off by like video game culture. I used to play video games when I was a little kid. Eventually, I decided to move on from that. Maybe kind of playing it a little bit casually here and there, but I'm not a gamer at all. Really, I'm really not. I don't identify as that that kind of that kind of lifestyle, and I'd rather spend my time doing other things like making astrology videos, for example. Um, One of the things that I kind of found disturbing about the whole video game stuff was that how many games are war games, basically. Like, you've got Call of Duty games, you've got even like stuff like Warcraft, like strategy games, where it's all about having armies and strategizing and blowing stuff up or going to war. And if you're not looking at video games, even sports, like, I mean, sports. I mean, I grew up in Canada where the most popular thing, I don't consider myself a sports guy at all, but I have to admit, if there was going to be a sport that I spent time watching, it would be hockey. Because there's something, I don't know, just of the being in the cultural milieu of Canada, there is a, there's something about hockey that is like, I just find it more entertaining to watch a hockey game than to watch basketball or baseball or football. Like, I can't, it's the most thing that I could get in, but hockey can be really violent, right? Like, it's like you got people body checking each other and like throwing their gloves off and getting into fist fights and slashing each other with the sticks, and it's like hockey can be really brutal, right? Um, and even in other sports that maybe don't have as much violence and just open fighting as hockey, there's this there's still this quality of like aggressive jocks, like, and us versus them, like it's like our team is going to war against their team, and it's this kind of like acting out of this whole warlike kind of conflict thing. And like, it's kind of like an undercurrent, I think, in a lot of like team sports, and even, of course, you got stuff like boxing, which is people just literally fighting each other. um and when I think about Aldebaran and Antares as being they represent these kind of rival stars, like they're like the two rival teams. um where, and often, it's like, I think the sports is a good example, because so often there can be sports teams which develop these rivalries where, like, maybe one team lost the championship against the other team. Like, here in Vancouver, we have this whole thing where we lost the Stanley Cup to the Boston Bruins, and there's a big riot, and there's also things where people like, there's such a sense of like hatred between, like, yeah, like, you just, the rivalry between certain teams can be so strong, right? Um, with Aldebaran and Antares, I think there's this quality where, I mean, to take it in another direction, I've been noticing, man. I'm not the kind of person who like avoids social media. I mean, I'm trying to work on my habits and spending my time more productively, but I have to admit I do waste a lot of time on social media, and I do, I can see the criticism about how so often it's just polarized stuff, or people getting into bickering matches with each other, or it just, it's not really the most if you want to get into a good like discussion about something, I'm at the point where I'm kind of disillusioned by Facebook, because just seeing what happens when people try to talk about things that are important to them, like, often it just kind of devolves into like a bickering match or something. But I sometimes I look at what people might be posting on Facebook, and it's like, so often we take these positions. um and I'm not saying that I'm guilty of this myself. I have my own opinions, I have my own positions, but so often we take this position. I'm going to use an example that I saw recently when it has to do with this stuff about like cancel culture and people being woke and stuff like that. And it's like, there you might some people, there's a lot of criticism anyways towards people that are overly onto this social justice trip. But what I notice is that when you've got something, someone to be there as an opponent, it's almost like it's almost like the sports team thing where I'm thinking about the Canucks and the Boston Bruins as a Canadian, right? Where it's like you lost the last championship to that sports team and now it's really heated. Like there's a palpable sense of like hate between one team and the other team. And when there's going to be a game between those teams, it's like it's on, and it's like the tickets are going to be selling for higher prices, and people are going to they're going to the everybody's going to be watching and wants to see like, oh my God, is he going to have his revenge? Is he going to get that guy who did the dirty hit and there's it's like that I think there's something about Aldebaran and Antares where it kind of amplifies this thing where like on some we I feel like we play this game where it's like people have their principles, right? That people might say that I'm taking this position because I believe in free speech, or I really am upset at the way that our culture has just everything's censored and that people can't express themselves and everything's all polite and politically correct, and that's really what I believe in and that's what I'm fighting for. But at some level it's like a bit like the sports game, I feel like, where it's like there's some level where you like to have a rival. You like to have an opposing team. You like to have a problem for which you can go to war for which you can attack the opponent and show off how clever you are and how witty you can have a comeback, and how you can just win the debate. You're like you're the expert debate club guy who has all the points that can and you can make the other guys like just totally humiliate the the opposition. And there's something about, I feel like, with Antares and Aldebaran, it's like we have this pretense that it's all about the actual principle itself, that we're just there because we're fighting for the values that we want to see in society. But it's like, let's be honest here. I think most of the time we get into these things which are like conflicts and fights and us versus them, and it's like there's something about it where we're like the sports team where we're excited for the game of it, right? We're excited for the challenge of seeing one guy go up against the other guy, of like the spectacle. Like I'm thinking about like when Jordan Peterson went up against Slavoj Žižek, and it's this big public spectacle, like a boxing match or a sporting event or something. And there's at some level, like, we take pleasure in this, right? And it's like, I'm just offering this anyways as a alternative point of view compared to what I was saying before. Let's like, when I was talking about Jupiter and Pisces, this guy isn't sticking around to watch the fight. You know what I mean? Like, this guy isn't there to guard his beliefs, to defend his position, to show up to like see the rivals clash. This guy is passing on the whole thing. He's like, you know what, I'm not into that. I'm peacing out. Like, I got better things to do with my time than that kind of thing. There's some more important truth to be learned than this sort of petty rivalry, this petty clash of opposing beliefs and polemics. I'm, see you guys later. I'm gonna look for some bigger truth here. I'm just gonna let that one go, right? And I think there's certain times when it's like everybody's got their opinions, and I almost wonder if our culture values this thing about having something to say, be able to express it, being able to like win over the whole. Richard Rohr had this line that I really liked, where America is all about winning. It's where it's like if you're it's like America's a country of winners, right? And it's all about beating the other person, and this culture of like, like the college sports teams and the champions, and we're gonna fight the other guy, and that if you there's this is I've heard also in spiritual circles why, in Eastern spirituality, there's this thing about surrender, but that can be such a incompatible idea with the Western psyche, because to surrender is to be a loser. So if you don't get in there and get your say in, you're just weak and you're passive and stuff like that. Whereas there's actually, I think it's interesting, this idea of how often do we value the quality of restraint, where it's like where you have something that you could say that would completely tear down the opponent, but you hold back and you don't say it? Or how often do you want to jump in there and get into an argument, but you decide to pass on it, and you walk away? Or that, and I think that's the kind of the lesson with this kind of Jupiter and Pisces, where it's just sort of like let it go and walk away. Versus the problem with the eclipse and the lunar nodes is that I think we have to be honest with ourselves and admit that part of us, there's a joy in the fight. There's a joy in the battle, and there's a reason why it's not. I mean, it could just be a bunch of military propaganda that why all these video games are like, Call of Duty and all the war strategy games. It's all just conditioning people to want to go. You spent your whole life sitting in the front of the Xbox killing people, and now you're conditioned to go into the Marines and go to the Middle East and actually shoot real families, right? Like, I mean, I'm sorry, but that is the American war machine. That's what they put all their money into, basically death and destruction. And we're conditioned to think that's okay, and we're actually conditioned to think that's a fun thing to do, right? Through the video games. That's a bit of a bit of a rant there, but I think that there's like this kind of deranged part of us that actually likes it. And I mean, in the midst of all this, I mean, I don't see people saying that about what's going on between Israel and Palestine. I think people are acknowledging that it's a tragedy, and it's terrible to see that of one group of people just annihilating and wiping out another people, of genocide. And I think there is at least signs that there's a consciousness of the brutality of war. But I mean, how much are we conditioned by all of our entertainment and stuff like that, that's playing off this sort of like the warlike qualities in ourselves? And how much do we have this sort of appetite where we want to go to battle, we want to fight the other guy, and we actually take some kind of pleasure in having the strategy or the skill or the, I don't know. I don't need to beat a dead horse with this one. But I mean, it's not only that, but the idea of having a rival or an opponent. It's like how much by having the other, right? Like, this is us, this is me, this is the other. And I can go on this huge rant about how the other is wrong and evil and blah blah blah, and it's like that is the other's there to play the role of antagonist, so I can be the good guy, or that I can write a whole rant about how these other people are wrong. But what I'm really doing is defining myself and saying, hey, everybody, look at me, this is who I am, pay attention to me, I've got something to say. And like, being basically, it's like, like, how much of this is actually, it's like the needy child who's trying to always get attention from the parents and say, look at this drawing I made, aren't I a good boy, don't I, aren't, you know what I mean? Like, it's like we live in a society where so many people are just like needy for attention. And we may come up with this whole thing of, it's like, this is some sort of important principle. Our society is going to shit, and I can't just idly stand by and watch this happen. I need to. But to me, this so often that just feels like a pretense where it's like, we do that pretense to like that's the respectable thing. We can't honestly say that I just need, I need some attention. I need people to value me and see that I'm important and that I have something to contribute. Like, that might be the more vulnerable thing that's underneath it. And we use the tough guy thing, like I'm going to go into battle and prove that I'm right, as a way to sort of be, like mama's good boy going out and doing the good thing. This is like the kind of, I feel like, the underlying dynamics under so much of it. Um, I've also, another thing about this too is that, like, in we're locally where I live, there's this whole thing about protesting the logging of Fairy Creek, the whole Fairy Creek logging protest. And at a basic level, I completely agree. Like, I mean, there's the amount of deforestation in BC and on Vancouver Island is actually pretty disgusting, to be honest. Like, we value ourselves as beautiful British Columbia, of having such great natural environment with these forests and mountains, and but when you actually get down to it, so much of that has just been clear cut, and the amount of, especially these old growth forests, I don't have to spent too much time explaining why that's an important thing, not to just wipe out all our old growth forests. However, there's something about even the most noble cause. It's like, there's something about going to war against the police, going to war against the government, going to war against, it's like it gives you a role to play. It gives you a story where there's a drama, as so many stories are built around a problem, a drama, a crisis, and acts of heroism. It gives us a role to play in basically a mythical archetypal drama, and to give our lives meaning, right? And we may pretend, I mean, I guess that's it. Like, there is a real value to protecting the environment and all this, but I think we also need to look at the fact that in some way, it's like James Hillman had this idea where he said that we need our problems, that we may act like problems are just problems, and the whole point of problems is to solve them, fix them, correct them, find justice, make everything right. But at the end of the day, there's all these people who are going to war for one cause or another, and it's like, at some level, these problems are food for you. Like, your soul wants these problems. Your soul wants these challenges, wants these conflicts. And when you are on the news being a hero, I think we have to be honest with ourselves and admit that at some level it's about saving the trees. At some other level, it's so that you can play the hero, and that you can be the good guy against the antagonist, and that your life is not just sitting around playing games. It's about, you are acting out this mythical story where it's the battle between good and evil, and you're on the side of the good guys, and that these forces are pushing us, and we're just simply like puppets being acted out by this grand force happening, right? And that's what I kind of see when it comes to Aldebaran and Antares, with this kind of Marsy, militant, rivalrous thing happening. Like, what's coming through for me is, let's take a moment to just be honest with ourselves, and look at, like, the pretense. Like, how pretentious are we if we just act like it's really about what we say it is, and look at some of the things that might actually be driving us into the underlying dynamics anyways, right? Man, I'm almost at an hour here. I've got more notes that I've made here that I can I can keep going. Um, oh man. Now, there's something. Okay, another thing about these eclipses. If you think, okay, let's to lead into it. So you've got the rivals, where one person is playing the role of the good guy, the other is playing the role of the bad guy, the other is playing the role maybe of the innocent victim. You've got, somebody may be the hero, somebody may be the victim that needs to be saved or rescued or protected. Somebody may be the persecutor, whatever. You've got all these different roles that we play out. You've got also the actual, if you think about life as a story, there's different genres of stories, right? Like, is this a war movie? Is this a drama? Is it a crime? And is it a detective investigating? Are we like in a mystery? We're trying to solve the puzzle and come to the answer, or is it like maybe it's just like a kind of a farcical comedy where people are making mistakes and it's kind of goofy and you kind of, there's all sorts of, or like the romance thing, there's all sorts of different categories of stories of which our life can take. Um, Now, there's a movie that I watched recently, which is, I think it kind of maybe it helped to scratch an itch because I used to like going out dancing, and with the pandemic, that's one thing that hasn't really been happening. But there's a Gaspar Noé movie called Climax, and it's like the first half of the movie is it's kind of like these Vogue dancers. It's kind of more of like a kind of dance choreography film. Um, and I don't want to like give. I don't want to spend too much time just explaining the movie or giving it away. But basically, it's like the whole movie kind of hinges on this thing where it kind of builds up all this sort of like nervous sexual kind of dynamics and partying kind of like to the climax point, and the climax point is this kind of like flip where the movie flips from a kind of a party movie into a horror movie where somebody spikes the punch with acid and then they all start turning on each other and it just turns into a bad trip. And like there's this thing. I think there's some potential, not to say that that kind of dynamic where something builds up and then climaxes and then it's necessarily a horror show or a bad trip or something, but there's these certain point. I think I like the idea of climax because it represents this kind of moment where it's kind of like interrupted and then things just change and then you go from one genre of a movie to another genre, right? Where you and like I think I mean, I don't really like the movie very much. Dust Till Dawn, the vampire movie, is kind of like that too, where the movie sets itself up in a certain way, and then like midway through the movie, they suddenly reveal that it's a vampire movie, and everything changes to be like a vampire shoot 'em up, rather where it was kind of like disguised in the beginning, right? I'm also a huge Philip K. Dick fan. And Philip K. Dick has a lot of stories, a lot of like Ubik is the one that comes to mind, where the first half of the story is taking a certain building, a certain kind of story arc, a certain kinds of characters, it has a certain form, and then in the middle of it, there's this interruption, and everything is completely different after that interruption. Um, I think that there's some potential with this eclipse that if you think about what's happened since the last eclipses we had, I if you think about what I was saying about Jupiter being about this kind of grand narrative, the grand philosophy, the kind of guiding truth, and maybe Gemini being about the smaller truths, they both have to do with storytelling in some way. Whether that's Gemini being the casual chit chat or gossip, or about Jupiter and Sagittarius being about some grand philosophy or grand meaning, they're both the process of storytelling. And I think that another way we can look at the eclipse is an interruption in the story. And that interruption could be a genre change of story. It could be the ending of one story and the beginning of another story, a new chapter, right? I mean, that's kind of basic, but there could be things like looking at our lives and saying, like, do we have people playing these roles? Is somebody the antagonist? Is somebody the victim? Is somebody the hero? Is somebody the ally? Is somebody this, this, that, and the other thing? And then so we can ask ourselves, is anyone really fixed into these roles permanently, or do we just kind of like put people in these roles to play out these temporary stories where it's like, you could be playing a game and be like, you're the like Dungeons and Dragons, you're the dungeon master. I'll be the wizard. You can be the cleric. He can be the fighter. He can be the thief. And we're all playing out these roles. And then later on, we start a new campaign, and everybody switches their characters, and maybe somebody else even gets to be the dungeon master, and they get to make the story up, right? Or it could be even like sports, like who's the goaltender and who's the on the offensive and it's like that we have all these roles and they may get shuffled around, right? Or you may have, as Shakespeare said, um, man, I'm not going to get the exact quote right, but like we're all actors on the stage, and we have our entrances and exits, and that we take different roles at different times. And there might be something with this eclipse that, like, you might really get wrapped up into a certain role or into a certain story, or you're playing a certain kind of game, and then there may be this moment where the rug's pulled out from under you, and or that everything just kind of gets shuffled up, and it's like, no, now you're playing this part, you're playing that part, and the whole it's just a new dynamic. And it's like, and you have this sort of like, if you're identified with a certain role, you could have a maybe existential crisis, right? And this is again why this guy Jupiter in the first decan of Pisces is a certain kind of non-attachment. You have to understand that roles that we've been assigned may only be temporary, and there may be a certain time where you just step away from that role and walk away, and we may be invested in these certain games we're playing, but at some point in time you realize it's just a game, and that life has got a different one in store for you, or that the meaning of one chapter is going to be different from the meaning of the next. So there we go. I got like a full hour here on the lunar eclipse. These are some ideas that I've been playing with. Let me know what you think. You can drop a comment or something like that. All right. Well, good luck to everybody. Hopefully make it through in one piece, and we can get through this summer eclipse season.